Hello, everyone, and welcome to this, our second session of the Core Enaction reading of the Embodied Mind. We will be looking at chapter 2 this week, today. Today's session, we'll be getting stuck into the issue of experience. In chapter 2, Varela, Thompson, and Rush set out some challenges facing any science that aims to take experience seriously. So too easily, we either dismiss experience as ephemeral or without power, or perhaps even epiphenomenal, or we often regiment it so that the answers to any questions about experience are essentially already determined by the ways in which we ask them. So in the first session, we recognize that cognitive science as an activity is always undertaken in a context, in an already existing flow of activities that has certain constraints and inertias to it. It already exists in our world, and the world therefore already has an impact on the way that the practices and outcomes of cognitive science unfold over time. So in this second session, we'll begin to unpack this idea in terms of the issue of experience in particular. And this is a core theme that runs throughout the entire book. One of the principles of which, of course, is that we need, in order to take cognitive science seriously, in order to have a science of the mind, we need to be able to take experience seriously, and we need a means of doing that. And that's just a tricky thing. Experience is essentially the most fluid of all things. There is a wonderful, famous interview with Bruce Lee in which he discusses the fluidity of experience and action within the perspective of his martial art. And he commends the viewer to be as water. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put water in a teapot, and it becomes the teapot. And experience has this same character, except only more so, right? There is no way to experience or to observe experience outside of the context of a particular activity, a particular engagement. When you're in the seminar, your experience becomes the seminar. When you are in the swimming pool, the experience becomes the swimming pool. When you're drinking a glass of wine, the experience becomes the glass of wine. And there just isn't any way that we can take the experience out and see it by itself. So there's no neutral or context-free way in which we can cope with it. And but neither is it true that we can just dismiss experience as epiphenomenal, as just, well, let's just talk about the world then, because there are many things that we do not experience, right? So there are large aspects of the world that we don't experience, and experience moves and changes in particular ways. And all of the science that we do is encompassed by this change and flow of experience as well. It's the very idea of something being empirical, is that it is caught up and captured in this ongoing flow of experience in which we always already find ourselves. So if we are to do science with experience and to take experience seriously, we can't put experience to one side, nor can we extract it and view it in some kind of acontextual way. We need to look for a set of practices that help us to discipline and be careful with and be sensitive to experience in a respectful and a sort of properly recognizing way. And there are different traditions that we can draw from. And in this chapter of the book, Varela, Thompson, and Rush explore some of those traditions, looking for practices and techniques that will allow experience to show up and to play a full-bodied role in cognitive science. As we'll see, there has been some quite significant development in the author's thoughts on this matter since the publication of the book originally in 1991. And Philippe is going to explore this in some depth over the course of his talk. But what we'll see is looking at first at the Western traditions in the chapter. There's an examination of the Western tradition, examining experience of ways of being mindful of experience and allowing experience to play a significant role for us. And in the book, they find certain limitations or constraints in this practice, and so they seek sort of expertise and useful practice in the search and understanding of experience from non-Western traditions, and in particular Buddhist mindfulness techniques, which they explore in the chapter also. So the process, the motivation, though, is very much in the broad thrust of trying to find a way to bring experience in a full and encompassing way into our cognitive science, so that we give it the recognition that it deserves, and that it is allowed to play the role that it seems to play, without us putting a straitjacket on it or forcing it into a role just that happens to suit us in a particular set of theories that we might have. So to bring us through this idea in a little bit more depth, and to allow us to unpack the contents of this chapter, we are very grateful and delighted to have with us and speaking with us today Dr. Philippe Blouin. Philippe is a graduate of Bishop's University, and also has done postgraduate study in the University of Montreal and of Rouen, specializing in Husserlian phenomenology in particular. And he has recently in 2021 published a book, La Phenomenologie comme manière de vivre. I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation of that. The Phenomenology as a way of life, from Zeta Books in 2021. And so what we'll see, what we're looking forward from Philippe today, is sort of taking that sort of expertise in Husserlian phenomenology and unpacking it in a way that perhaps allows us to get a more nuanced and up-to-date picture of Husserlian phenomenology as it may play a role in the enactive approach going forward. So as we'll see in the 91 text, there were some limitations to the way Husserl in particular was interpreted, and that the thinking of the authors has developed quite significantly from this. But the aim, or the themes, as we'll see emerge, maintain that commitment that we saw in our first session of keeping the relationship between the knower and the known unbroken. That as we recognize ourselves as being embedded and immersed in the world, so we don't break that immersion in order to study it. And so without further ado, I will shut up and I will invite Philippe to explore with us what it is that is human experience, on chapter 2 of the Embodied Mind.
Great. Thank you, Merrick, for this introduction. So I guess there's not much more to say in terms of presenting myself. Merrick, you did a good introduction there. I wanted to start by reiterating how much of a pleasure and truly an honor it is to be participating in this conversation with all of you. So as Merrick mentioned, my particular field of expertise is Husserlian phenomenology. So that's the lens I will be adopting here in reading this chapter. I'll be bringing that part of my background, I think, to the conversation. So I will, without further ado, try to share my screen here. And maybe before I do so, because I think I'll lose sight of you when I share my screen, I want to encourage you to ask any questions while I'm going through this. And I know some of you were writing comments in the chat last session that we had, but I don't think I'll see the comments in the chat as we're talking. So if you want to use that as notes for the conversation after, that's fine. But if you'd like me to address a point immediately in the conversation, which I encourage you to do, feel free to, I think, raise your virtual hand. That will see, I'll see you that you have a question that you would like me to address during the presentation. So feel free to do that. Okay, let me try to share my screen here. How does that look?
Works well.
Works well. Okay, great. So as you can see, what I'll be exploring here is the relationship, the general relationship between phenomenology and the book, The Embodied Mind. To get us started, I would like to quote from the revised edition. I took these 3 quotes from the various introductions, and I think that they can serve us as a good guiding thread for this conversation that I would like to have. So let me quote them, and I'll say in what sense they'll be relevant for our conversation today. So beginning with John Kabat-Zinn, he says, one might say that we are moving toward an intimate yet universal, non-reductionist, non-dual understanding of the phenomenal world and our place in it. The embodied mind was and is a major stepping stone along that trajectory. All of these quotes, as you can see, emphasize this non-dual understanding of the phenomenal world. Evan Thompson formulates it this way. He says, is it possible for cognitive science and human experience to reshape each other in a transformative way beyond our scientific and habitual experiential reifications of a separate self and an independent world, he asks. These questions were the ones that motivated and inspired us when we set out to write this book. So you can see that attacking this distinction between self and world is truly a fundamental part of this book. And Eleanor Roche confirms this by saying there's another mode of knowing not based on an observer and an observed. So all 3 authors here, at least at the introduction, emphasize the importance of this non-dual understanding of the phenomenal world. And I think this can serve us as a guiding thread for the present discussion. I think to a certain extent, I would propose, I assume, that it's this idea of non-duality that brings us all together here to a greater or lesser extent. And it definitely is, or at least that's what I would like to propose, it definitely is the common ground between phenomenology and enactivism. So I think if we want this conversation to be fruitful, we should keep in mind this idea of non-duality, and I'll definitely be returning to this, especially in the last section of this presentation. So keep this idea in mind. We'll explore this throughout, and we'll return to it, especially in the end. So here's a brief plan of my presentation. I was told not to assume that everyone here is familiar with what phenomenology actually is, so I was thinking that it would be good to begin this with a brief, much too brief, crash course on phenomenology. For those of you who are familiar with phenomenology, might be a good revision, might be a little bit simple for you, but don't worry, because I'll quickly be moving from the basics of phenomenology to some pretty deep metaphysical questions that immediately arise out of this. And this will be one of my angles throughout this presentation. I don't want to stay at the basics. I want to tackle some of the big underlying questions here that are raised by this dialogue between phenomenology and enactivism. And I take these questions to be metaphysical in nature. So we'll be exploring that dimension as well. So in the second part, I will briefly consider the relevance of phenomenology to the embodied mind. We'll then turn to the critiques of phenomenology in the book. Although it's clear that the authors were drawing from phenomenology, and especially from Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology in their effort to revalue or reemphasize the importance and value of human experience for the cognitive sciences, it's also clear at the same time that there was a bit of a tension between these 2 approaches, and they wanted to, I don't want to say pick and choose, but they wanted to draw inspiration while at the same time distancing themselves from certain aspects of traditional phenomenology. So we'll look at what those critiques were, but then we'll turn to the reappraisals of these critiques in the revised edition and later works by the authors. So we'll see that their initial appraisal of phenomenology, and especially of Husserlian phenomenology, was not quite accurate according to their own later understanding of Husserlian phenomenology. So in a sense, that means that my work is cut out for me already, because as a Husserlian, I won't have to defend Husserl since the authors have done so themselves. But that being said, despite the reappraisal and the reappreciation of Husserl in their later work, I think there remains some unresolved tensions that I would like to draw your attention to between phenomenology and enactivism. So one source of tension has to do with the relationship of theory to practice, and another unresolved tension has to do with what we can call the transcendental dimension of experience, as it is considered both in phenomenology and in enactivism. So I'll have a lot more to say, and I'll explain what I mean by the transcendental dimension of experience later on. And finally, I'll return to the common ground here, the commitment to non-duality, in my conclusion. So I hope that I can do that within less than an hour to leave as much time for discussion as possible. So I'll try to be mindful of the time here. Okay, let's begin without further ado. So the idea of phenomenology was founded, the project of phenomenology was founded by Edmund Husserl at the turn of the 20th century. So he's truly the father of contemporary phenomenology. Many people don't know Husserl, although they've heard of the students or the disciples of Husserl, who were great philosophers of the 20th century who were influenced by his ideas. You may know of, well, probably know of Martin Heidegger. Of course, he's probably the most famous student of Husserl. But you may also have heard of Lévinas, Merleau-Ponty, as well as Hans-Georg Gadamer or Paul Ricoeur. Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, Jacques Derrida, pretty much every single influential continental philosopher, at least in the 20th century, was directly or indirectly influenced by this tradition founded by Edmund Husserl. So needless to say, this is quite an influential current of thought in the 20th century. Now, we can, if we're looking at Husserl's work, it's marked by three important texts: the logical investigations that were published in 1901, the ideas for a pure phenomenology and phenomenological philosophy. He's not very good with short titles, as you can see. For short, we just call this book Ideas 1. And finally, that was published in 1913. And finally, The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology in 1936. So as you can see, Husserl was born in 1859 and died in 1938. So the bulk of his important work was done in the second half of his life. And each of these works marks a kind of transition in his thought. The logical investigations really lays down what will become the method of phenomenology. But you see an important turn in between that first work and the second big work in 1913. We call this the transcendental turn, or some people call it the idealist turn of phenomenology. This is where Husserl begins to adopt a more radically idealistic metaphysics. And so phenomenology adopts a metaphysical view, beginning with this book in 1913, and later on he will continue to refine his investigations and look deeper and deeper into the various layers of experience, and that will lead him to develop a new form of phenomenology that some have called genetic or generative phenomenology, that looks at the developmental roots or origins of the various structures of experience, and that really lays the foundation for his later work. So there's a transcendental turn, and then there's a genetic turn in Husserl's thought. Now, we can simply understand his project by claiming that his overarching aim here throughout his entire works, and although I've emphasized the transitions here, I think we should conceive of these transitions as a deepening of the same fundamental project, not as radical phases in his thought, as though he were contradicting himself later on in his thought. So he's actually very consequent throughout his entire philosophy, and his overarching aim can be said to be to try to lay the foundation for the sciences by showing how our theoretical constructs, our idealizations about the world, logical and scientific, are rooted in what we could call the broad field of experience. So it's clear that science is rooted in experience, but the way we understand experience in this empiricist, positivist manner is mostly by referring to the objects that manifest with an experience. So this sense of empiricism is tied to object consciousness, and Husserl, along with other thinkers of the time, I'm thinking here of William James and Henri Bergson, who were observing the same thing, is that experience is much broader than just object experience. Experience appears to us in a form of field, or in the expression of William James, as a stream, the stream of consciousness, and the stream of consciousness is broader than object consciousness, which constitutes the basis of science. So we'll return to that important distinction, but the key idea for Husserl is to show how all of our idealizations or theoretical constructs are somehow rooted in experience, right? And to show what is the genealogy, right? What is the origin of these theories by looking at how they're grounded in experience. And so phenomenology, a basic definition of that would be that it is a descriptive study of conscious experience. And this is, of course, the word logos refers to the study aspect of phenomenology, and the word phenomenon here should be understood as meaning conscious experience. So that's how we understand phenomena from a phenomenological perspective. Another way of saying it is by saying that phenomenology is the study of subjective or lived experience, right? So the idea of Husserl is that by describing experience carefully, we can see how science and the objective structures of science are in continuity with subjective experience. They're not in opposition with subjective experience. So Husserl's point is to try to rehabilitate subjective experience as that thing which has been left aside by traditional science, and to show that in fact it's not antithetical to science, but that in fact science presupposes subjective experience. It's rooted in it. So that's his overarching aim. Now, that being said, let's try to give ourselves a little bit of a more concrete idea of what phenomenology looks like in the flesh. And we can do that by turning to a beautiful drawing by M.C. Escher. You may be familiar with the crystal ball. And I think this serves us as a beautiful illustration of what phenomenology looks like when you're actually doing it. So to do phenomenology, you have to take a step back from your normal engagement with things in the world and look at how the world gives itself to you from the first person perspective, right? And what you do at that point is, once you become aware of your own subjective stream of consciousness, your own conscious experience, then as a phenomenologist, what you do is you would try to describe this experience in a manner that will extract from this flux of experience some fundamental structures. So you're not interested in the particular content of your experience, you're interested in the necessary or invariant structures of your experience, things that have to be there in order for there to be experience at all. Okay, so if we're taking this example of a spatial object, which is what the focus of this drawing is here, right? M.C. Escher here is holding the crystal ball. That's a spatial object, an object of perception. Well, on this basis, we could use this as an example of an act of perception, of objective or object perception. And then we can ask ourselves, what is this object perception? What are some of the necessary structures of object perception? One thing we would immediately notice is that in every act of perception, there seems to be a kind of polarity between a perceiver, right, the kind of spotlight of attention that seems to emanate from the subject as it is aiming towards an object. So there is a subject-object intentional structure in every experience. So it's not just this particular act of perception. This is just an example that we're using, but if you hold any object whatsoever in front of you, you will see a book, a bottle, or anything at all, that perception always respects this kind of subject-object polarity. Then another thing we could notice, and it's maybe the only mistake with this very realistic depiction of experience here by M.C. Escher, is that if you compare this illustration to your actual experience, you'll realize that there's a mistake in a sense in this picture, which is that there is no foreground and background, right? But in our real conscious experience, there's always one thing that is in the foreground, which is the object of your attention, and then everything else seems to be fading away in a blur towards the horizon of the background that you're not immediately aware of or conscious of. So that's another fundamental structure of experience right there, the foreground background structure. And we could go on like this, right? So right now we are, in a sense, doing phenomenology together as we are trying to describe in a rigorous manner our own experience. Now, here's a couple of things that I want to point out with this example from the start to clarify some perhaps potential misunderstandings of what phenomenology amounts to. First of all, phenomenology is not a kind of introspectionism, right? So by introspectionism, we mean the study of our internal mental state, as opposed to or as a correlate of our external bodily state. Now, phenomenology is not the psychological counterpart to a kind of psychophysics a la Fechner or Wundt or Titchener. Actually, if you look at the drawing carefully, you should see that the internal experience of Escher here in this picture is actually has nothing to do with the inside of Escher at all. It actually corresponds directly with his perception of the outside world, right? What this drawing brings out is that what we naively assume to be given to us as out there is in fact always tied to a first-person perspective. So it's as though in daily life we forget ourselves and simply look at the world as though we were seeing it from a third-person or impersonal perspective, from a view from nowhere, as Nagel famously put it. But in order to begin to do phenomenology, we must first awaken to this kind of self-forgetfulness and regain awareness of our own awareness, so to speak. So that's the first step to do phenomenology. It's not to go inside yourself, it's to realize that whatever you're experiencing outside of you is, in a sense, always related to you. So there's a kind of almost identity between the inner and the outer from a phenomenological perspective. So it's not a kind of introspectionism. What we're examining by experience, we mean exactly everything that manifests itself to us in general, not just our inner mental state, so to speak. So it's not introspectionism, and it's not concerned with the particular contents of our individual mind. So it's not a kind of personal or individual psychology either. And that would be the difference between perhaps this drawing and what we do in phenomenology. I'm not as a phenomenologist, I'm not trying to simply describe my experience, Philippe Blouin, nor was Husserl ever interested in the particular details of Husserl's own biographical life. So it's not a kind of glorified navel gazing, we could say. What Husserl was doing when he was studying his own experience was to try to extract the invariant structures of experience, of any experience whatsoever. So the result that I was describing a second ago by saying that there's a fundamental subject-object polarity is not something that is valid only for my experience or for Escher's experience. It's something that is universally and necessarily valid of all perceiving beings, of all acts of perception entirely, right? So that's what we mean by an invariant structure of conscious experience. It's not the conscious experience of Husserl or of myself, or even, Husserl would argue, of humans. It's what we are studying are the fundamental structures of experience itself, and wherever experience manifests itself, it has to obey such structures, if it is going to be at least an experience of spatial objects, let's say. So for there to be spatial objects, there has to be a subject-object dichotomy, there has to be a foreground-background structure, things like that. So phenomenology is the systematic study of these invariant structures of conscious experience, as well as their genealogical embeddedness. And what I mean by this is that the later Husserl was interested also in trying to deconstruct experience in order to determine what are its different layers. And we can he developed a method, which is quite simple, in fact, which attempted to determine what are the older, more ancient, more primitive layers of consciousness, and what are the more sophisticated, more developed layers of consciousness. And in this case, if I'm return to my example here, we can distinguish object consciousness, the consciousness of spatial objects, from a pure kind of immediate felt consciousness or consciousness of sensations, which don't open onto spatial objects. And Husserl would argue that this primitive form of sensory consciousness is older than this more sophisticated form of spatial consciousness, which is exhibited in this drawing here. So how can we know this? Well, we can think of one structure without the other, but we cannot do so inversely. So if a given structure is genetically more primitive than another, it can be conceived to exist without it, right? So I can conceive of sensory consciousness without object consciousness, but I can't inversely conceive of object consciousness without sensory consciousness. And that would prove, for Husserl, that sensory consciousness is more primitive, is more fundamental, is genetically older than object consciousness. And we could do the same thing with every stratum of consciousness, all the way up to our highest conceptual idealizations, as we do in science, right? Which would be perhaps the most sophisticated, newest forms of consciousness, right? Think of mathematical theorems, for instance. In order to reach those kinds of states of consciousness, you first have to go through perceptual consciousness, and before that, you had to go through some kind of instinctual, sensory, primitive consciousness. All of these things are stacked together in a kind of matryoshka-like structure of nested layers. Okay, so at this point, what I would like to do is to give you a very specific example of a phenomenological description by Husserl himself in his initial groundbreaking work, The Logical Investigations. So what I would emphasize with this example is well, it'll kind of confirm everything I've said so far, give you an even more concrete example of what phenomenological description looks like. But then quickly, I will move from this to more important metaphysical implications, and you will see that phenomenology is thus not just simply interested in our experience, but it's interested in making some fundamental claims about what reality is in the end, on the basis of these phenomenological descriptions. So phenomenology is, in a sense, it is a form of metaphysics, right? So we'll see how that unfolds. So let's read the example here by Husserl. He says, I see a thing, for example, this box. Now, imagine he's holding a box like Escher is holding the crystal ball here. But I do not see my sensations. I always see one in the same box However, it may be turned and tilted, but each turn yields a new content of consciousness. Very different contents are therefore experienced, though the same object is perceived. The experienced content, generally speaking, is not the perceived object. Okay, so what Husserl is noting here is that in every act of perception, right, you've got something that stays the same, namely the object itself, while the experience of the object is constantly itself changing. So it's the same ball that Escher is holding in his hand. Even if he moves the ball away from it, if he turns it, the appearance of the ball is constantly changing, but at the same time, there's a sense in which it remains identical to itself. So every experience of a spatial object exhibits this intentional structure. On the objective side, you have an identical unity that is aimed at the object. On the subjective side, you have what he calls a continuous multiplicity or a pure flux, a stream of experience. Thus, what Husserl is claiming here is that the appearance of a thing is not the same as the thing appearing. Appearance or phenomenal being is constantly changing, like Heraclitus's river, while that which appears within this stream of consciousness preserves a relatively stable identity. So this is a fundamental phenomenological distinction, right, which demarcates two categories of being for Husserl: subjective experiences or consciousness on the one hand, and spatial or physical object on the other. So this phenomenological distinction, in turn, as I want to show now, has radical metaphysical implications for Husserl. And these will be fully outlined in the second important work by Husserl, Ideas 1, published in 1913. So there, Husserl will argue in what would become the infamous paragraph or section 49, that since an objectless experience can be conceived, but not an unexperienced object, then experience is ontologically prior to spatial objects. Let me repeat that reasoning. Since an objectless experience can be conceived, but not an unexperienced object, then experience, conscious experience, is more fundamental than objects, physical, spatial-temporal objects. Okay, so this has been taken traditionally to be an assertion of idealism, stating for Husserl that somehow conscious experience is ontologically prior or more primitive than physical spatial-temporal nature, right? He's asserting a priority of consciousness over nature, or physical nature, at least, in this passage. So, on the basis of the distinction, this phenomenological distinction we just drew between the field of appearance itself and that which appears within the field of appearance, right, between conscious experience as a field versus objects that appear within the field, he will go on to draw a massive metaphysical conclusion from this, which is to say that the physical world of spatial-temporal objects requires experience to exist, but that the inverse is not true. In other words, for Husserl, conscious experience can exist independently of the physical world. Now, this does not mean, importantly, that for Husserl, everything exists within the mind, as opposed to out there in the world. And why not? This is an important point, I think. The reason for that is that for Husserl, the stream of experience is self-appearing. It's self-standing, in a sense, right? The field of appearance, what is manifesting right there in front of me and around me and within which I have to find myself, is not something that exists within my mind for Husserl. Rather, I find myself as a part of this stream much like I find objects as part of this stream. What Husserl seems to say in his, after the metaphysical turn in Ideas 1, is that this stream of consciousness, this field of appearance, is its own substrate, its own support. It doesn't need to exist in a mind, nor does it need matter to exist to support it. So the field of phenomena is not an epiphenomenon. It's not somehow the product of materialist physical mechanisms, right? Notably mechanisms in the brain. It's not the product of this, nor is it somehow something that exists within a subjective mind in a truly idealist way. So this for me is why, by the way, the term idealism is not quite adequate to describe Husserl's mature metaphysics. So to give you a bit of an example of what we can mean by this idea that the field of appearance is self-appearing, if you take the example of a sound, for instance, the sound heard, let's say you're listening to rain outside of your house. You're not looking at what is causing this sound, so you're just hearing something, some kind of trickling happening. You can say that the sound heard appears to you, right? So what you're hearing is the rain. That's an object out there in the world causing you this sensation. So the sound heard appears to you as a subject, but the hearing of the sound, the pure qualitative feel of the sound, does not itself appear to you. In fact, you are indissociable, inseparable from the hearing itself. The hearing is constitutive of and thus indiscernible from yourself. So in other words, the subject is identical to her stream of experiences. Our minds are not like a blank screen on which experiences are projected. Rather, we are our experiences, we do not have them. Right? So the stream of experience for Husserl constitutes subject as much as it constitutes object. The subject-object polarity is something that appears itself within the field of experience. And so experience is itself prior to the subject-object divide. Right? And this, I think, is what I'm getting at here.
I'm sorry.
So thus, oh, sorry. Is there a question there?
Yes. Hi, Philippe. I have a small question. If you could go back to the previous slide.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So you were saying here that the hearing of the sound heard appears to a subject, but the hearing of the sound does not itself appear to the subject. But to be able to make this observation that the hearing itself doesn't appear to the subject, it would require making the hearing itself explicit in some way. So it would require to make it appear. So would it require some special kind of reflection? Maybe I'm running ahead here and it's something we'll get to later on, but does this imply a sort of a special mode of reflection to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, excellent point. You're right to point out that the way the hearing manifests itself to us is fundamentally different than the way that the heard manifests itself to us. So the heard manifests itself to us through perception. You can perceive the rain, right? That's exactly what you're doing when you're hearing the sound outside of you. But how do you hear the hearing itself? So you can't perceive what is a precondition for perception itself. So your expression is correct. I think what we need then is a kind of reflexivity. But the reason I think we can even talk about this, even though we can't perceive it, is because there is a kind of intrinsic reflexivity to sensation itself. And that's what I mean by saying that it is self-appearing, right? You don't need, for your lived experience to be lived, you don't need to actually be reflecting on it in a conscious manner, because the living itself contains its own form of self-manifestation. It's intrinsically appearing. So a feeling of pain to exist needs to appear. Right? You cannot dissociate the appearance from the feeling. In this case, the feeling and the appearing is one and the same. You can conceive of a free-floating pain, right? That is not somehow manifesting to a subject. So, but you can conceive of a free-floating rain, a rain that is not perceived by a subject. So the feeling, the hearing of the rain itself is self-appearing. It has to appear to exist, unlike the object of perception. So that's a fundamental distinction that is part of the ontological distinction I was alluding to earlier between what manifests itself in experience and the experience in which that which manifests itself. So that would be one of the key ways to distinguish between these two modes of being. Is that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank
point?
you. That's definitely sufficient for now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's a big question when you're asking how can we develop a method for this. In French, there's a nice distinction that Henri Bergson draws. He says, your lived experience is not meant to be perceived, it's meant to be lived. So there's a mode of access which goes through the living here, which we refer to by lived experience, which is very different from the mode of access that you have when you're looking at or perceiving something objectively. Okay, so you can return to that later. You can see that I'm spending a lot of time here on Husserl and on the metaphysical implications. This will have some important implications later on for when we turn to the relationship between phenomenology and activism. So just to wrap up what was said so far, in a nutshell, Husserl is neither a metaphysical realist, meaning that he does not believe that physical reality exists independently of conscious experience, nor is he a subjective idealist, which is the position that would state that everything exists within the mind. Rather, he is what we could call an experiential monist, or what I've called an ontological phenomenalist, where the phenomenal stream of experience, the stream of experience, is conceived as prior to the subject-object or mind-world dichotomy. So that's how Husserl cuts at the dualistic thinking of subject and object, right? He posits experience, the full field of experience, as first. And by first, I mean ontologically first, in the sense that there is no further underlying reality to the field of phenomena. Okay. If you'd like to, no, this is debatable. There are multiple interpretations of Husserl's metaphysics. I've argued, well, quite recently, as you can see in an article and in my book, but I've tried to publish this part of my book separately. So if you're interested in this interpretation of Husserl, you can refer to that article that's about to be published in Husserl Studies. Okay, moving on. So what exactly is the relevance of phenomenology to the embodied mind? So here we can refer directly to the authors themselves of TEM, where they say on pages 19 and 20, they write, within our Western tradition, phenomenology was and still is the philosophy of human experience, the only extant edifice of thought that addresses these issues, the issues of how do we fit experience within our broad understanding of the world? And phenomenology is the only edifice of thought that tackles these issues head on. Now, I've kind of suppressed the word human there, and I hope that from what I've said so far, it's clear why, in fact, phenomenology should not be conceived as a philosophy of human experience. It purports to be a philosophy of experience, period. Right? So it's not a psychology, it's not an anthropology. Phenomenology understands itself in a broader, more metaphysical manner. Now, that being said, the authors of TEM draw more from Merleau-Ponty than from Husserl. It's clear that they consider Merleau-Ponty to be a precursor to enactivism because he opened a middle way between, or an entre-deux, as he says himself, between self and world, and between science and experience, right? That was the focus of Merleau-Ponty's work. He was building on Husserl, and he was constantly thinking of the relationship between science and experience, as was Husserl. And he was also trying to undermine this Cartesian dualistic understanding of self and world by going back to a study of experience. He's known for, especially his having developed the concept of the lived body. He uses the term chair in French, which is a translation itself of the term that was used by Husserl, which is Leib, as opposed to corpore, so the lived body as opposed to the physical, three-dimensional, spatiotemporal body that is studied in anatomy, for instance. So that's your subjective body as opposed to your objective body, we could say simply. Now, why is that concept of the subjective body, of the lived body, so important for Merleau-Ponty and for the authors of TEM? Because it's always been considered for phenomenologists as an emblematic locus of a fundamental ambivalence that we find at the heart of experience between the feeling and the felt. Now, in a sense, I was already hinting at that with this subject-object dichotomy. Merleau-Ponty explored this more in the context of the example of the hand that he gives. The hand can be both a palpating tool that you use in exploring the world, but it can also be felt. It's not just a feeling appendage or organ, it's something that can be felt from the outside. And so when your left hand is touching your right hand, you have this kind of duality or ambivalence where each hand can be at the same time the subject of the feeling of sensation and at the same time the object of sensation, right? And so Merleau-Ponty analyzed this ambiguity and tried to show throughout his work that in fact this can be extended beyond the mere example of the human body and applied to the entirety of the world. I'll come back to this important idea, but for Merleau-Ponty, just like for Husserl, the phenomenological analyses of the body were not meant to be applicable or valid only for humans. It was meant to be a kind of gateway to better understand nature in general. And so Merleau-Ponty will be led to posit that this ambiguity, feeling felt, is at the heart of existence itself. Everything in the world manifests in a sense. And he will call that later on the chiasm, this kind of ambiguity. He will also emphasize the role of action in perception, and that will be clearly important for the authors of TEM, but also for later authors in that tradition that will emphasize motor or operative intentionality, the fact that what we perceive is always somehow correlated with our kinesthetic powers of moving, right? And again, it should be noted that each of these aspects of Merleau-Ponty's thoughts were actually not so much radical innovation as developments of what was already there in Husserl. Merleau-Ponty is one of the best readers to this day of Husserl, and he is one of the, I think he's actually the first researcher outside of Leuven to go to the Husserl's archive in Leuven. Those were all of the unpublished manuscripts the 40,000 pages of unpublished manuscripts by Husserl that were salvaged from the Second World War and brought by Van Breda, the father Van Breda, to Belgium to be saved from the Nazi plague. So Merleau-Ponty was one of the first visiting scholars to this archive, and he read through the unpublished manuscripts of Husserl, and he saw all of these very, very powerful unpublished manuscripts on Husserl's phenomenology of the lived body and motor intentionality. All of that was already in Husserl. So he is a brilliant, Merleau-Ponty is personally perhaps my favorite philosopher of all time. He's brilliant philosopher, but his insights still stem from Husserl, it should be pointed out. Okay, so it's a very brief indication of how phenomenology was seen as relative to the project of enactivism. By focusing on lived experience, it gave them the tools, or one set of tools, we can say. The other set of tools, of course, coming from the Buddhist tradition. It gave them one method to properly analyze in a rigorous manner, in a scientific manner, we might want to say, subjective experience, thus reintegrating subjective experience within the scope of science, which is quite subversive, thinking that, generally when we think of subjectivity, we think of it as that which is an obstacle to scientific thinking, right? That from which we have to abstract in order to conduct science. So phenomenology is, as it is itself, a science of experience, and so it kind of turns science back onto its blind spot, its historical blind spot, and that's, I think, what the authors of TEM were also trying to do, to reintegrate subjective experience within the scope of science. But they were very critical of Husserl's philosophy, and you can see that still in the introduction and throughout the book. Not the new introductions, but the original introduction of the book, or the first chapter. They're critical of Husserl's Cartesianism, of Husserl's representationalism, and the absence of a pragmatic dimension or applied methodology in Husserl. So what do we mean by each of these critiques? So by Husserl's Cartesianism, we mean that it feels sometimes when we read Husserl that because of his method, which is to turn towards experience as it manifests itself right now, and to put questions of physics aside, right? And put the question of how does this conscious experience relate to the external world, relate to physics aside, we bracket the external world in that sense in order to turn towards the internal world of consciousness, then it sounds like Husserl is condemning us to develop a philosophy of subjectivity, much like Descartes, without giving us a way to bridge subjectivity with objectivity. It sounds like he wants to completely reduce objectivity to subjectivity, which is another flaw, according to these authors, because both subjectivity and objectivity should be considered to be equiprimordial, I think, according to the authors of TEM. So that's one way in which Husserl was limited, they argue. And also, he did not seem to care much about the embodied aspect of experience and the consensual or intersubjective aspect of experience. We'll soon see that this reading was not entirely correct. So I'm pointing out the critiques, but you can hear from my tone that I don't agree with these critiques already. Then they describe Husserl as a representationalist, meaning that in their view, again, conscious experience is a representation or is distinct from the physical world out there. And so they thought that phenomenology was understood itself to be, in the Husserlian sense, a description of our internal representations of the world, And so it rested on still a fundamental dichotomy between subjectivity and physical reality. And so they thought that Husserl was still in this representationalist understanding of consciousness, which obviously they're trying to uproot in TEM. So finally, there's a third critique which I think to be quite interesting and relevant, which is that in Husserl, there's not a lot of text that tell us how we should be conducting a phenomenological investigation. So your question earlier, Atul, was to the point, because he seems to be applying a method that he is not particularly explicit in describing, right? In terms of how we should apply it on a practical basis. So, okay, I'm realizing that it's already been 1 hour, and I've only done a brief part of what I wanted to tackle. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster here, and I want to make sure we get to the unresolved tensions. But I'll go a little bit faster in what is left, so to make sure that we have at least, let's say, 45 minutes of discussion. I can stay a little bit longer, of course, if you would like to pursue this anyway. Okay, so in Mind and Life, it's important to note that Thompson came back to these critiques and he refuted all of them one by one. And that I find to be quite impressive, because it's very rare that authors take the time to correct themselves when they've recognized their own mistakes. And so he says himself on page 414 of Mind and Life, he says, in particular, I now believe that Husserl was not a methodological solipsist, that he was greatly concerned with the intersubjective and embodied aspect of experience, that his theory of intentionality was not a representational theory, and that his theory of the life world was not reductionistic and representationalist. Furthermore, although I think phenomenology has tended to overemphasize theoretical discussion in the form of textual interpretation, to the neglect of phenomenological pragmatics, as well as original phenomenological analyses and philosophical argumentation, I think it is too facile to say simply that phenomenology is a purely abstract theoretical project lacking a pragmatic dimension. So basically, it seems like Evan Thompson read Husserl again and completely changed his mind. It's interesting to know that of the 3 original authors, he is not the only one to have continued to deepen his understanding of Husserlian phenomenology. Varela continued to do that in partnership, notably with Nathalie Deprat, who happens to be one of the great Husserlian scholars today. And I was lucky enough to have her as a co-supervisor to my thesis. I don't know how things happen historically, but my impression at first glance is probably that by encountering Nathalie Deprat, she probably influenced Varela and Thompson, or encouraged them to reread Husserl, because she knew the updated Husserl, which is coming to light now that we have all of these unpublished manuscripts are now being published. And so we're seeing that he was greatly concerned with intersubjectivity and things like that. So they went on to kind of compensate for this deficiency in Husserl by developing a pragmatics of experiencing in this book on Becoming Aware, published in 2003, where they developed a systematic method to do phenomenology. So their method is a 3-step method. You start by suspending your naturalist attitude, which thinks that the world exists outside of experience and doesn't require experience to exist. So this is what Husserl called the epoché. You bracket this naturalist idea, and that allows you to return to refocus your attention from the external world to the internal world, which turns out to be the flow of experience in its full breadth. And from there, you develop an attitude of letting go or acceptance of experience in order to let experience speak to you rather than you try to understand it, explain it away. So all of these components develop a kind of practice of phenomenology, and they were trying to formalize this in a more rigorous manner in this book. So that being said, although their initial critiques of phenomenology were mostly recanted by Thompson and I think Varela, there's still some interesting unresolved tensions between phenomenology and enactivism that I will quickly want to point to in this last part of my presentation. So I'll begin here with a quote from Eleanor Roche in the revised edition. At this point, she's talking about phase 2 enaction. We have gone beyond phenomenology. Yes, this is a controversial claim given Heidegger's account of being in the world, where there is no split between subject, object, consciousness, and world, followed by Merleau-Ponty's psychology that extends this foundational idea. Added to these are the new interpretations of Husserl, based partly on material of his not available when our book was originally written. But there's a difference between such ideas as philosophy or scientific theory and what results from the actuality of a mind in the non-dual awareness that can be brought about, uncovered is probably a better term, by Buddhist meditations, contemplations, transmissions, and other practices. So Eleanor Roche here doubles down on the initial critique, saying that there is a fundamental lacuna in traditional phenomenology, in that there's nothing really equivalent to Buddhist meditation or Zazen meditation or Tai Chi. Right? When you think of these truly embodied practices in Eastern spiritual tradition, it's clear that they are drawing their insights into the nature of consciousness from those embodied practices in a way that is still lacking in phenomenology, despite the reappraisals. Okay, and another point she makes is that the kind of non-dual consciousness that Buddhist Eastern practices speak to us about is not the same as those that we find in Heidegger, she says here. In a nutshell, she thinks that in phenomenology, there is an appreciation of a pre-reflective form of consciousness, which Hubert Dreyfus has called skillful coping, right? So that's, you may be familiar also with the notion of flow in the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, right? When you're deeply engaged in an activity, you're focused, all of your attention is focused on doing what you're doing in the present moment, and that leads you to a kind of pre-reflective consciousness where you are no longer so much self-conscious of the distinction between yourself and the world. You're completely immersed in the world. But here she claims that this is not what the Buddhists understand by non-dual consciousness. It's not just an active engagement in the world. In fact, she says that's a kind of romanticization of samsara, right? Being fully engaged in what you're doing in a sporting activity or at work is not the same as Zen Satori or Buddhist, enlightenment. And to get at the distinction here she's drawing, I think we could refer to Alison Gopnik's interesting distinction that she makes in her book between spotlight consciousness and lantern consciousness. And she attributes lantern consciousness, which is a more kind of panoramic kind of consciousness of the world, to babies. And in a sense, perhaps we can understand spiritual practices of meditation as trying to reactualize in a grown-up state of consciousness, lantern consciousness. So she's making an important distinction there between these two kinds of non-dual consciousnesses, but only one is truly spiritual in nature. And so there's 2 points here. One is that there lacks a truly embodied practice in phenomenology, and phenomenology is unaware of lantern consciousness because its understanding of non-dual consciousness has to do with skillful coping, not with a kind of panoramic consciousness that you attain only through spiritual practices of meditation. Now, I'm going to skip this part because I won't make it to the end. I just want to say that, there's more in phenomenology than I think Eleanor Rosch recognizes here. First of all, it's clearly the case that in Heidegger, at least, there is not just the understanding of non-dual consciousness as active engagement. There's another very important form of consciousness that he describes in various texts, but that he describes as the kind of openness to the mystery of being, right? And in his later writings, this mystical state of consciousness becomes more and more important. And it's this aspect of Heidegger that precisely was drawing the Eastern philosophers of the Kyoto school to Heidegger, right? So there's a bit of an irony there, I think. He also described this attitude as Sein-Lassen, or letting be, or Gelassenheit, a kind of detachment or serenity, a term that he derives from the mystic Meister Eckhart. So there's this whole mystical component to the thought of the later Heidegger that I think can serve as a truly important resource to think this non-dualistic consciousness that Rosch is talking to us about. And it's clear that for Heidegger, this attitude is more than just a theoretical endeavor. It's really something that is supposed to shape an entirely new way of being, a way of being that is not so much driven by the will to mastery towards the world, but rather a kind of open-ended awareness and acceptance of the world as it is in itself. That's what he means by letting be, right? And that, I think, is deeply consonant with what she's seeing in the spiritual traditions. So this is something I've explored in detail. If you're interested in my book, if I'm allowed a little bit of shameless self-publicity here, which precisely the title indicates, Phenomenology as a Way of Life. I think phenomenology is much more than just a theoretical endeavor. It was always meant to be something that was existentially transformative, and you can see this clearly in this quote by Husserl, where he writes in the third last important book that I mentioned earlier. He says, perhaps it will become manifest that the total phenomenological attitude and the epoché belonging to it are destined in essence to effect at first a complete personal transformation comparable in the beginning to a religious conversion, which then, however, and above this, bears within itself the significance of the greatest existential transformation, which is assigned as a task to mankind as such. So he thinks that his practice of phenomenology bears the potential for a deep, deep, deep kind of existential transformation, comparable indeed to a religious conversion. So there's a lot to be said about this. We can keep this for discussion, but it's clear that there is an existential dimension to the phenomenological method or practice. I think that should be pointed out. Okay. Thompson has a word about the relationship of theory to practice as well. I think I'll simply skip this point because I want to make sure this is the final point here. I'm reaching the end. If you will bear with me for just another couple minutes, but it's a key one. Okay, so that's the second unresolved tension between, I think, enactivism and phenomenology. So the first one has to do with the relationship of theory to practice. I wanted to say that Rosch has a good point in saying that there's a lack of embodied practice of this dimension in phenomenology, but there are perhaps resources for us to dig a little bit deeper there. The other important point that Thompson highlights is the transcendental dimension of experience. And this is an important quote from the new introduction. He says, "It is important to keep this enactive conception of science in mind when we think about the dialogue between cognitive science and phenomenology. Not keeping it in mind means falling back into an objectivist conception of science, for which embodied experience becomes simply another object of empirical investigation." So when they talk about a circularity between science and experience, they don't want to say that the description of experience should just be integrated into the natural sciences. That would be to adopt a reductionist attitude towards experience, and they definitely want to avoid that. Experience cannot be reduced simply to neurotransmitters and neuronal mechanisms, and so what they want to do is hold these two complementary perspectives together without suggesting that experience can be reduced to physical structures or anything like that. Okay, so the way he emphasizes this is as such. He says, "But lived experience is inevitably distorted when we treat it this way. That is, as being completely comprehensible through scientific procedures and objectification. Embodied experience is precisely not objectifiable in this way, for it is that which makes possible any of our cognitive encounters with any object. Remembering this non-objectifiable dimension of embodied experience, that embodied experience is a necessary condition of possibility for anything showing up as an object of scientific investigation, prevents the relationship between phenomenology and science from becoming lopsided in favor of science." That's a key point. So the point here is that we should not lose sight of what should be called the transcendental dimension of experience, that which makes object experience possible, and thus science, if science takes object as its starting point. What do we mean by the transcendental dimension of experience? Well, it's precisely that non-objectifiable aspect of experience, right? Earlier, I had emphasized that the field of experience is broader than object experience, right? The entirety of that which appears is broader than, the entirety of the field of appearance is broader than that which appears within the field of experience. Okay, that's one way of understanding what we mean by this transcendental dimension of experience, is that it is non-reducible to object. It's rather the field within which object appears. So there's two ways to understand this dimension, this transcendental dimension. One would be an epistemological interpretation, another an ontological one. In Waking, Dreaming, and Being, Evan Thompson will go on to argue that consciousness has an epistemological primacy, in that it cannot be reduced to scientific theories or scientific constructs, but not necessarily an ontological primacy. It's not necessarily first in the realm of being. It's first in the realm of knowledge, but not necessarily first in the realm of being. So he says here, consciousness is our way of being, and it cannot be objectified, that is, treated as just another kind of object out there in the world, because it is that by which any object shows up for us at all. He also says, since consciousness by nature is experiential and experience is primary and ineliminable, consciousness cannot be reductively explained in terms of what is fundamentally or essentially non-experiential. Okay, such as atoms. So at the same time, however, he concludes, we can't infer from the epistemological primacy of consciousness that consciousness has ontological primacy, in the sense of being the primary reality out of which everything is composed, or the ground from which everything is generated. One reason we can't jump to this conclusion is that it doesn't logically follow. That the world as we know it is always a world for consciousness doesn't logically entail that the world is made out of consciousness. Okay, having said that, he goes on to argue, however, that we need to work our way to a new understanding of what it means for something to be physical, in which physical no longer means essentially non-mental or non-experiential. Such an understanding would replace our present dualistic concepts of consciousness and physical being, which exclude each other from the start, with a non-dualistic framework in which physical being and experiential being imply each other or derive from something that is neutral between them. So it's clear here we're reaffirming what we started with at the beginning, our commitment to non-duality. Evan Thompson is driving at that here. He's saying we need to reconceive of what we call nature or physics, the physical world, in a way that doesn't exclude consciousness from the start. You can think here that it sounds like he's opening the doorway to something like panpsychism or pan-experientialism, perhaps. It's not entirely clear what he has in mind there, but he says the way for that new understanding of physics and nature to happen concretely is by adopting something like Varela's neurophenomenology, a method that combines the experiential and the physical from the start into a complementary and I would like to say ambivalent method that can swap back and forth from the first person and the third person perspectives and integrate them into a coherent whole. Okay, that is how we are going to proceed. Now, what I'm critically raising here as a question for debate is whether neurophenomenology can actually achieve this revision of physics or nature if we've started by saying that we cannot infer from the epistemological primacy of consciousness an ontological primacy. My question is, what possible way is there then to argue for the ontological primacy of consciousness, right? So how is neurophenomenology exactly going to validate or argue for a kind of thesis of identity between mind and matter, if that is the purpose here? And I would like to recall that this project purports to be, in fact, what used to be called metaphysics, right? To defend a view of nature as having a kind of intrinsic experiential component is a metaphysical stance. And traditionally, or at least in modern times, we've rejected metaphysics as being purely speculative and not grounded on scientific method. And so that has kind of left a dark shadow over metaphysics. And it seems like the authors of TEM and Varela and Thompson in their quest for defining a new method also want to avoid doing pure metaphysics. They want their program to be anchored in science. But what I'm wondering is whether this circularity that they're postulating between experience and science is not obscuring the true relation here, which there should be between metaphysics and science. After all, metaphysics traditionally is understood as proceeding over empirical investigation, right? Because metaphysics is orthogonal to empirical science. Metaphysical theories are underdetermined by empirical data. So it's not empirical data that can confirm or infer metaphysical theories, which leaves us with the question, well, what then can confirm or infirm our metaphysical speculation? Well, that was precisely the purpose of phenomenology in the first place. It was to try to anchor metaphysics in experience. In a sense, we can even say that phenomenology is a kind of experiential metaphysics, which thus tries to enlarge what we understand by experience to the point that it is capable of accommodating special forms of experience that may have metaphysical import. So here I claim that instead of a relationship of circularity, we might want to return to the traditional image of a tree, famously depicted to us by Descartes, where he conceives of the tree of knowledge along this symbol, and metaphysics is defined by Descartes as being the roots of the tree on which the rest of the sciences can flourish. And I think that image is perhaps more adequate to the proper distinction that we should trace between empirical science on the one hand and metaphysical inquiry on the other. So in conclusion, both phenomenology and enactivism share a common commitment to non-duality. Both approaches see the lived body as a key locus to explore the unity of mind and matter, or subjectivity and world. Phenomenology, however, wants to move from the embodied mind to the chair du monde, to the flesh of the world, in Merleau-Ponty's memorable expression, right? It doesn't want to stay focused on human experience. It wants to move from experience to the entirety of what is. And in that sense, it has the resources to do so because it is an experientially grounded ontology or metaphysics. Eastern spiritual practices should be, I think, viewed in the same light. In meditation, you're not just trying to reach kind of a state of relaxation or to diminish your stress levels, as we tend to interpret, or use these practices now in the West. The point is to really look into the nature of being, right? Which I take the purpose of at least Zen meditation to be. It's to experience directly the true fundamental essence of reality as it is in itself. So there's an embodied component to it, and there's a metaphysical component to these Eastern practices. And I think the phenomenology is very much in line with that double aspect of these practices. Now, my critical question in return is, can enactivism or neurophenomenology find a similar passageway from the life of the body to the life of the world? Does it have the resources to develop the non-dualistic ontology that I think clearly all authors of the book are trying to fight for, to defend, and to justify? So I'll end on this critical question. Thank you all for your attention. Happy to exchange with you on any of these topics. Sorry if I felt rushed a little bit at the end there. I was trying to leave us more time for a discussion.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So there's a wealth and a richness of material there. I'm keen that we want to keep as much time for discussion as possible, but I am also aware that maybe we want to take a very brief break. I have it as 29 minutes past the hour. If we try to reconvene at 33 minutes even, at least get things going, and sort of people can filter in as and when they're rehydrated. We'll get the discussion kicked off then. So in the meantime, ponder how if there's anything you want to throw into the discussion. We've discussed it with Philippe before. The same rules apply, which is it doesn't have to be coherent, just has to get something started. So if we have some questions in the chat already, and if you have any even half-formed thoughts that you'd like to just sort of throw out as indicative of your thinking, your confusion, please be ready to do so. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Start to get the conversation going. So is there anyone wants to throw out the first question or general thought or response to the material that Philippe was discussing? This sort of interesting sort of returning to phenomenology that has been the case over the development of the author's work since the initial publication of the Embodied Mind. So while people are pondering there, I guess we might take some possible links to questions from the chat, perhaps. There's a hand up there.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I'm just wondering, does the epistemological or ontological priority of the field of experience say something about the hard problem of consciousness? Because if you say that that's prior, then you can't really reduce it to anything. So I'm just wondering, what would the science of consciousness look like if you can't reduce it? to like manageable parts that you can make predictions on, and you can like do engineering and stuff like that, right?
Excellent. Yeah, excellent question. I think it is a stance towards the hard problem that reverses the question. The way that Chalmers formulated the hard problem was by asking, what are the physical underpinnings of consciousness? How can the wine of consciousness be extracted from the waters of neurochemistry, basically? When you look at the question, that's a particular stance on the mind-body problem that assumes a physicalist already postulate. But Husserl begins with the inverse postulate. He says, what is really real is, and what we have to start with is this thing we call the stream of consciousness. That first immediate direct experience is my standard. It's my measuring stick for what I mean by reality, and everything else is constructed on the basis of this. So he is led to kind of, I think, flip the hard problem on its head. The question for Husserl is not how does physics explain consciousness, but how does consciousness explain physics in a way. So another way of answering your question is to say that there is no way to reduce consciousness to atoms. You'll never, as Thompson was saying in that passage, you'll never, from non-experiential entities, you'll never recreate experience. If you start from the postulate that the world is composed of material forces and entities like quarks that are in themselves non-mental or non-physical, then it's simply impossible to imagine how those kinds of entities would conjure up through whatever form of self-organization something like the feelings, the perceptions that we commonly attribute to experience. So that's an intractable problem, which means that probably it's ill-posed. So I don't know if it goes one way, a certain way to answer your question, but Husserl's answer to the hard problem would be that it's impossible to explain subjectivity by way of objectivity, quite simply.
If I can just ask like a follow-up, if that's the case, then does that preclude the possibility of like taking like an engineering perspective, like a design stance, let's say, because that's just is, right? Like the experience is just is, then like how would you be able to manipulate it in ways like traditional science would do it, like create stuff, stuff like that?
I guess we could return usefully to the distinction that Chalmers was making between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard one. I think it's imaginable that certain aspects of experience could be explained in using typical empirical methods, or at least they could be imitated to produce AI generating chatbots, for instance. Or simply robotics can find inspiration by imitating human experience. But those would be a kind of this is a kind of program that at best can explain or imitate certain aspects of experience, but not what experience is fundamentally, which I take to be phenomenal experience, which I take to be the qualitative field of experience. I don't think that there's any possible way to have a tractable empirical method in explaining that raw qualitative feel of experience. So in that sense, that to get at the hard problem, so a radically different approach is required here. And Chalmers was, in a sense, was right in pointing to that, even though I don't necessarily agree with his particular panpsychist formulation or solution to this. but something like a radical panpsychist solution is needed, where we return to the realm of metaphysics here, rather than simply assume that empirical science will give us the solution to consciousness. So a step out of the empirical approach is required here.
Pitch it here for a moment, and can you hear me? Is my audio present? Yes.
Yeah.
So first, I want to thank you for this amazing talk where a lot of information was covered, and I need to channel my excitement now into a coherent question. So I'll try to do that here.
It doesn't have to be coherent, remember.
Okay,
Anything
yeah,
goes.
Exactly. I'll just spit it out. So also relating to the hard problem. I think Merleau-Ponty gives us also some guidance here, because he grapples with both ends of the spectrum and tries to also understand where science fits into the picture. So there is a primacy of experience. So that's kind of what the phenomenological ontology establishes. And at the same time, experience finds itself embodied, and it finds itself in the flesh. And so we can find these correlations in the brain. And Merleau-Ponty makes the statement that the seer is also visible. So the one who sees can also be seen, and we can, basically the perceiver can rediscover the structures of perception in its own body. And that kind of gives a place to do science about experience, which will itself be a flow of experience. So science itself is embodied and part of our existence, but experience can turn back onto itself and discover what makes itself tick, and unfold that as a sort of a stream of information or a stream of knowledge. So I think that the hard problem in that sense can still be broached in a way. We don't have to fully, we don't have to just rest with experience and say there's no neuroscience to be done. Like, I think we can kind of combine these two worlds and find a middle ground there. I just want to just add the point that I actually wrote my thesis about this exact problem of combining Merleau-Ponty's non-dual ontology with the hard problem, and applying it to see how they can feed into each other. So I'll link it into the Slack group chat, and if anyone here wants to give any comments, I would be honored to hear your thoughts about it. So I'll leave it with this little comment that maybe a non-dual ontology can give place for both, for a science of experience and an experience of science, and the middle ground.
Superb. Thank you, Otto. Philippe, do you want to make a particular response to that? We have other questions queuing up as well, or?
Yeah, I want to maybe add a little something to that, which I think you're absolutely, there's like a fine line in between saying that there's an aspect of experience that is simply unobservable, and therefore that is unlikely of ever, but not unlikely, that is in principle can never become an object of science and scientific investigation, right? That which is non-objectifiable cannot become an object of scientific inquiry, unless we broaden our understanding of what science is and adopt a broader method that includes something like phenomenological investigation, right? And phenomenology in that sense is a science of experience, but what you mean by science is, of course, objective empirical science that begins with observable phenomena, publicly observable phenomena, moreover, right? So it begins with a certain layer of experience that is already very sophisticated, whereas phenomenology goes back and asks, what are the layers of experience that make objective, publicly available objects possible in the first place? And so I doubt that the analyses of experience that go at that depth in phenomenology can find counterparts in empirical science. And so I think we have to be careful in what we consider to be psychophysical correlations here, as though there was a kind of one-to-one identity between the physical phenomena of the brain and the experiential phenomena. I don't think that Merleau-Ponty is simply prolonging the psychophysical program, which was in existence prior to phenomenology, right? It goes all the way back to the founders of contemporary psychology, and so he never understood his project as a kind of psychophysics, precisely because he takes experience to be fundamental at an ontological level, not just to be something that can be examined in humans or animals, say. But so I don't know if it's I think there's a that point is important. There's a dimension of experience that is simply non-observable, and therefore for which we cannot find any empirical correlates, is what I would say. But meditation can observe it, and phenomenology, being a form of meditation, can go into those depths. Okay, yes. I think the next person was...
Thanks, Philippe. So I think Nadav.
Yes, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was curious whether Husserl or the phenomenological tradition in general has a theory or explanation of how this more categorical experience of the world or object subject duality arises from the raw sensory experience.
Thank you. This is, I guess, the fundamental question of genetic phenomenology, right? How does the intentional structure, subject-object structure, emerge from a more fundamental or more primitive form of experience? And if you were to read the early Husserl, you would think that there's nothing more fundamental than the intentional structure of consciousness. But if you read into the later post-genetic turn Husserl, so everything after 1980s, 1918, right, after the year 1918, you will see that he was trying to dig further down into the deeper layers of experience, and he comes up with some very interesting analyses that have to do with what he called instinct intentionality. And so the fundamental structures of experience for Husserl have to do with impulses and instincts, not unlike Schopenhauer or Freud for that matter. And from this primitive, primeval form of consciousness, then you can try to imagine how, from instinct and intentionality, something, the subject-object dichotomy might emerge. But you need to complement Husserl's analyses here with more research on the matter. I devoted a whole section of my book to that problem, and I tried to use Piaget's developmental psychology as well as Michael Tomasello's evolutionary anthropology to try to see how our normal human consciousness emerged from a more primitive form of consciousness. And we can draw from these other fields of study that take an evolutionary perspective, both an ontogenetic perspective and a phylogenetic perspective. We can use that to inform our own genetic phenomenology. And the answer to that is very complex. It has to do how we became self-aware in the first place, because there is no subjective, there is no self-awareness, and that happens through intersubjective interactions. And I think there's a very rich field of studies that show the importance of joint attention or joint intentionality in leading up to our own capacity for self-consciousness, right? And so I would draw there from those studies to try to give a better explanation of how that comes about. But it's a pretty, I think, a pretty complex explanation. It's a pretty complex question, and Husserl gives us some resources, but they're not enough. They're not sufficient, so we can complement them with contemporary psychologists.
Right. Okay. Marcia Cano, your hand is up next, I think.
Hi. Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I think I misunderstood Husserl in a lot of ways after watching this and hearing your talk. And secondly, happy International Women's Day, especially to all the women that make this seminar possible. And third, here goes my question, and I think it has a lot to do with the last question. And I'm interested in how our experience is built interactively, and I still don't find a way how to explain this in Husserl or even in the reading of the Buddhist psychology that I found in this chapter. I'm trying to, I don't know how to formulate the question with this, but it's something, I think it has to do with the way and how we develop our experience in the world that, I don't know, it's, I still think that these authors think about their own experience, but not related to others. And I'm just wondering, and even with joint intentionality, I don't think that's quite the point or quite the answer to this point. I am still thinking about this and just wanted to step out and add a comment about that.
And we are very grateful that you have. Thank you. That is excellent. So
so if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that, oh, sorry, I lost sight of you, Marcia, right?
Yes.
You're suggesting that in phenomenology, and there perhaps is not enough of a focus on intersubjective experience and too much of a focus on individual experience. Is that
exactly? Yes.
Okay, so in the, let's say the published writings of Husserl during his lifetime, it is the case that he seems to adopt a Cartesian solipsistic perspective, but you should know that there's 3 volumes that have been published on Husserl's manuscripts on intersubjectivity. I mentioned briefly, but Husserl's unpublished manuscripts were enormous, much more voluminous than the published text during his lifetime. They account for 40,000 stenographed pages of manuscript. So that's the German method for writing in a short cursive manner, which allows you to write basically as fast as you think. And there's 40,000 pages of that. We're still now publishing there's new Husserlian material coming out, and so there's plenty of work that was done by him to think about the relationship between different subjects and how that is fundamental in shaping our understanding of the world. And I think he was one of the great pioneers, in fact, of the philosophy of intersubjectivity. He spent a lot of time thinking about the concept of empathy, the capacity to feel with and through others, and how that empathic web of interpersonal relations were actually essential in building what we come to think of the objective physical world. So not only is it an important dimension, it's an absolutely essential dimension to Husserl's explanation of objectivity. How do objects come to be constituted with an experience? It goes through the web of empathic relations, and he didn't say much about joint in attention or intention. That's more contemporary psychology, but I think those fields should be complementary. We should take an emotional look at what it means to relate with other people at the level of the pure felt immediacy of interpersonal relations, but also there's a kind of a semi-cognitive component in figuring out what others are looking at, and on that basis coming to realize that others have different perspectives than me, and from there coming to the concept of an object, which is, as Husserl clearly stated, an object means that which is potentially seeable by everyone. So within the very idea, he says clearly in Cartesian Meditations, he says the very idea of an object holds the sign or bears the sign of the open-ended community of subjects. It's that which is manipulable, observable, perceivable by anyone. So you have to build up to that by way of our intersubjective relation. And so intersubjectivity is a precondition for objectivity, he would say. So I would encourage you to look into those aspects, because there's a wealth of studies that and a lot of researchers since then that have expanded on the important the premises of this research that were laid in Husserl, but continue to be developed in later phenomenologists afterwards.
Superb. So we have time perhaps for one more question. We can fit one in, Maxime.
Yeah, thank you. I have a rather, a very brief reflection, which I was writing in the chat about the, the theoretical and conceptual prerequisites of this very argumentation on reflection and about the place of experience, because, I'm not sure actually if reference to phenomenology and in particular to Husserl is so necessary in this regard, because I think that probably if to say about at least Varela's contribution, and I'm not saying about the fact that Varela was the only author of this work, but still, I think that this refers to reflection, to the analysis of the observer's experience of being observers, and all this kind of recursive, reflexive stuff is much closer to Varela's earlier preoccupation of the self-reference stuff and recursivity, which implies some kind of phenomenology, but not in the strict sense of phenomenology as a historical discipline. So I suppose that we should take into account, while analyzing the stuff from the first chapter about the reflexive scientist and the second chapter, in which there are references to these experiences of observer being observed or being more attentive to your own experience. So historically, it might be more correct to refer to Varela's earlier preoccupation with the mathematical work. I mean, the work of Spencer Brown and this cybernetic stuff. I mean, von Förster and his idea of reflexivity and self-reference. So I think that here we can face the problem of our overall task of this seminar, whether we consider it as the source of relevant theoretical argumentation applicable to nowadays cognitive scientific research, or rather as a historical artifact, which implies that we have to be more attentive to historical contexts such as cybernetics, systems theory, self-organizing systems, and many other contexts in which, for example, Varela was more involved, and which developed this kind of prerequisites for enactive cognitive science. So this is rather my own impression and not rather a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. So would you like to respond to that, Philippe, or we have maybe a minute or two?
So, I'm not well versed enough in terms of the enactivist school of thought to make any assertions as to its contemporary value and its lasting value, and I think one thing I was trying to bring out in my presentation is that to the extent that enactivism does metaphysics, it isn't doing empirical science. And to the extent that it is doing empirical science, it's not doing metaphysics, because those two fields are orthogonal to each other. I think it's important to re-emphasize the distinction against a kind of circular understanding of science and experience, which is promoted in that book. So I think it's clearer if we come back to the traditional understanding of the relationship between metaphysics and empirical sciences. Now, the mathematical formalization of experience has to do with the empirical side. I don't think that we'll be able, personally, that's my hunch, I'm open to be proven wrong, that we'll be ever able to develop a mathematical understanding of what we call phenomenal consciousness, at least. We might be able to formalize certain aspects like linguistic, the linguistic structures of experience. We might be able to formalize, the relationship between perception and memory, different types of memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. All of these little components of consciousness might be, analyzable to the extent that they can be broken apart. And, I see there's a lot of work being done with the free energy principle and all of those guys that are taking the formalization of experience to the next level. But I keep coming back to the question, but how does that explain the hard problem? How does it explain the fundamental nature of consciousness as a form of awareness, or awareness, period? And I doubt that any mathematical construct, I doubt that you can derive the qualitative from the quantitative, to put it as simply as possible. So it all depends on what is the purpose of enactivism. Is its purpose to explain consciousness using math? If so, to me that would be a doomed endeavor. Is it to make sure that we give full value to experience within our broader empirical investigation? In which case, it becomes a metaphysics. And the purpose of metaphysics is to guide and to direct the course of empirical investigation. It cannot derive from empirical investigation its own conclusion, because its conclusions are of a different order altogether. So I was pointing to that tension because I think enactivism is truly in between the empirical and the metaphysical, but in a way that needs to be clarified. They're committed to both endeavors. They want to be a fundamental philosophy and an ontology on the one hand, and they want to be an empirical science on the other. But that relationship is not one of circularity. So they have, I think, to clarify exactly what their true purpose is. That would be my impression. But I'm open to different interpretation.
Well, that is a wonderful challenge with which to finish the session. I think that will certainly real food for debate there, and I would encourage everyone to thoroughly muck in and sort of make their feelings known on the matter very clearly and or obscurely, if that's how it starts off in the Slack channel at this point. I think we'll need to move to that. But I think there's a real challenge, and it'll be interesting then to watch this unpacked as the readings of the chapters progress over the next few sessions, to see how much these kinds of themes arise and how whether or not that circularity can be formed. So there's an interesting challenge that you put down, particularly in your final slides, about the roots of the tree and the firm grounding of the metaphysics. And of course, this runs counter to a lot of the themes that are present in some of the later chapters. So there will be an interesting circulation, I think, between the kinds of material that you presented and that logical argument, and the ways in which it will feed back, and has clearly, as you've pointed out as well, has fed back over the subsequent work of Evan Thompson in particular over the subsequent decades. So Thank you very much for everyone for your participation, for your involvement in the session and its liveliness. And thank you very much in particular to Philippe for the richness of that presentation and the eye-opening reinvigoration of Husserlian thought within enactive thinking. And as I mentioned, the conversation will continue, and let the debates commence on the Slack channel from this point onwards. So with that, we will finish up. And for our next session, then in 2 weeks, I think it's Marika van Voigt on representations, which is going to be another interesting challenge.
In 2 weeks, Marika van Vogt will be giving her presentation on chapter 3. So please join us, same time, so 6 p.m. Central European time. And see you all very soon on the Slack channel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Matt.